David Davies, you've had your concerns about the direction of Brexit policy for some time. Why decide to resign now?
Well, because the new policy that we are going to propose to the European Union, the new negotiating position, involves two things which I think are not in the national interest, or at least they're not going to deliver what people think of as a proper Brexit. Number one is the issue of using a common rule book. That means a common legal rule book, the statute book. We'll be having identical laws to the European Union set by then, and although Parliament will nominally have the right to change them, in practice if they do, they suddenly put a problem on the frictionless border, so-called, because you have inspections. But even more seriously, they might actually trigger the fallback option in Northern Ireland, and so no British Parliament will actually do that voluntarily. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the issue of the customs arrangement, the new future customs arrangement. It actually involves collecting taxes effectively for the European Union. Now we know what they're like about this because they're already taking us to court over the tariffs being paid on the Chinese textiles. An organisation called OLAF enforces it, and they will almost certainly insist on that for this new arrangement. So the European Court will have a say over our borders. So those two things seem to me fundamental issues. Now, you could argue that if you want a very, very soft Brexit, you should maybe want to be willing to give that. I don't want to do that. I don't think that's a step too far for me. And the final issue is the negotiating strategy. That if we make volunteer yet another offer, that the Union on past practice is quite like to sit back and say, well, that's very interesting, what else have you got? So those three things they're quite big and bigger than the other arguments. Arguments in the past have been within a sort of acceptable range, but this one I think is one too far.
Some have said that what you're doing here is putting the national interest ahead of the Tory party's interest. Is that how you see it?
Well, I don't think of it in those terms, but I wouldn't argue the case that I'm worrying about the national interest. Frankly, the arguments about the Tory party's interest, 6 of one, half dozen the other. I mean, so far the place hasn't blown up. I argue against the people who want to put letters in and all that sort of thing. I think that's nonsense.
So you would want the Prime Minister to stay?
Yes, I'm a supporter of the Prime Minister. I think she's a good Prime Minister. I just don't agree with her on this fundamental policy, which unfortunately is central to my old brief. It would have been me that had to carry it out, me that had to present it to Parliament, me that had to make it work in the European Union. And frankly, if I don't believe in it, I'm not the best person to do it.
And just to sum up, I suppose, what your principal position is here, I know, because we've spoken about it, you had a pretty clear view what you think the British people voted for when they voted to leave the European Union, and your concern is that what the Prime Minister has put on the table effectively breaches the trust that people placed in her.
Well, I put it slightly, you're right, but I put it slightly differently. I would say that if you sort of if you could somehow get a single mind for the 17.5 million people who voted to leave and said, do you think that's taking back control of laws? Do you think that is doing away with the rule of the European Court of Justice? They'd probably say no to both, and that's my test. Now it's a judgmental test. It's the test I'm making. I haven't talked to all 17.5 million, but that's my view.
Now, back on the back benches, a position you've relished in the past.
Yeah.
How do you see your life?
Well, I've barely had time to think about that, frankly, in the last 24 hours. But I view being a backbench member of Parliament as an incredibly privileged and incredibly powerful role. I've fought campaigns in the past on torture, on civil liberties, on surveillance, on all of those things, and hopefully with a little effect. And there will be other issues in the future which I will be fighting campaigns on. Some of them will be related to Europe. I mean, I suspect my first speech back in the Commons will probably be on customs union and the trade bill next week. So I will be using the information and knowledge I have, hopefully for the advantage of our policy, our national interest and our government.
And very finally, should your colleagues be surprised that you've resigned, given your contribution to that important historic debate at Chequers on Friday?
I don't understand the question.
Well, what I'm saying is, what I'm really asking is, when you made your contribution to the debate on Friday, were you clear about your reservations?
Oh, I was absolutely clear about my reservations. Everybody understood it. Indeed, one or two other members of Cabinet referred to it and took it as a reference point in their arguments to raise concerns about this policy. I actually started what I said with the words, Prime Minister, as you know, I'm going to be the odd man out in this debate. And I made it very plain what my concerns were.
Sorry, finally, would you expect other colleagues to resign? Would you like them to resign?
No, that's not. Look, that's not my judgment. That's not for me to judge. I wouldn't take any notice of anybody else saying you should resign, Davis, at all. In fact, I'd probably make me go in the other direction, and I would not extend that discourtesy to anyone.
Mr. Davis, if the Chequers plan, and the Prime Minister thinks she can get a deal on the basis of it, if that comes back to the House of Commons as the basis of a deal, will you vote for it or against it?
I'll vote against it. It would be rather odd for me to resign over something and then vote for it when it came back. In my view, the Chequers proposal, it's not a deal, we shouldn't call it a Chequers deal, it's the Chequers proposal, is actually almost worse than being in. I mean, we will be under the rule of the European Union with respect to all of our manufactured goods and agri-foods. That's a really serious concession. What about take back control? Doesn't work. That actually leaves us in a position where they dictate our future rules with us without...
Now, this is presumably the last Conservative Party conference before we leave the European Union. Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary, on the front pages of the newspapers today, describing the current proposal on the table as deranged. What's the adjective that you would choose to describe the Chequers plan?
Just wrong. I mean, Boris specialises in more dramatic language than me, but it's just wrong. I mean, it just doesn't do either what the referendum led people to expect, bring back control of laws. It absolutely explicitly doesn't do that, and it doesn't bring back control of borders. So those two things straight away, and it's much more than that, but just two things straight away. It doesn't meet our referendum promise, or indeed our manifesto promise. So it's not something. Even when it's done, even when it's concluded, if we got Chequers, the Europe issue wouldn't go away. The toothache we've had for 30 years on this subject would still be there for another 20 years. So it's not the right answer.
So, you can't help but thinking, we're here, aren't we, in a situation 6 months before we leave the European Union. Theresa May says that the only credible proposal on the table is Chequers. You say that it's wrong. You've got to take some responsibility for that, haven't you? Because you were Brexit Secretary for 2 years.
Well, you should read my resignation letter. I mean, I told her at each stage where I thought we were going the wrong way, from the way we started negotiations immediately after the election campaign, the concession on Ireland in December. I said, no, that's not the right way to go. The Prime Minister at the end of the day is the lead negotiator. She decides. At each stage, I thought, well, maybe I can make that work, even though I don't think it's right. But eventually, I got the point, you can't make it work. It is so far off what is the right strategy.
So why did they listen to you? Because you've got to take responsibility for that, then, haven't you? You failed to have any influence. Oh, yeah, well,
and I do. I say, I failed to persuade the Prime Minister. That's quite right. And the simple truth, however, is you've got a whole system here. I mean, if you added up all the permanent secretaries who voted to leave the European Union, I suspect you'd come to the answer zero. The whole of Whitehall has a particular perspective, and I think, as I've said already, they misread Europe. They misread the way the negotiations should be played. They also misread what was an acceptable outcome for the British people. Now, all of those things, one man couldn't stop. One of the reasons for resigning was to make it absolutely plain that this issue was not capable of being resolved the way the government was going. I couldn't do that in government. I always, in government, in cabinet, took the view, I'm not going to brief, I'm not going to spin, I'm not going to talk against my colleagues. You can only do that outside the cabinet. That's why I resigned.
So who is to blame then? Is it Theresa May? Is it the officials around her? Is it Ollie Robbins?
Oh, it's a mixture of all. I mean, I don't pick out individuals. I know people love to pick on an individual, but actually, it's the whole system. It's stacked in a certain way.
And by the system, do you mean the civil service?
The civil service, the advisory group, all these people, and the simple truth is that actually there is a resolution, and by the way, you say it's only 6 months. Actually, that's plenty of time, bluntly. I've always said to the Prime Minister from the beginning, the issue in this is going to be the last month. It's not going to be the 2 years that run up to it. It's going to be the last month, because the European Union always uses time, always tries to pressurise you, always takes you to what they call the cliff edge, and then sees if you panic.
So you think there will be a deal then?
Yeah, I think there will be a deal. I think it's 80–90% likely there'll be a deal. And I think actually the deal will end up as something like what Boris calls Super Canada, what somebody else called Free Trade Plus, basically a free trade-based deal. But we're going to have a very scary few months. Between now and about November, it's going to be really scary. Everybody's going to be calling each other's bluff. There's all sorts of brinkmanship going to go on. That's normal. That's the European Union, daily bread, and that's what we've got to be ready for. That's why we're making the argument now. That's why it was important to resign in July, because we've got to make the arguments in the last round. Chequers won't fly. It won't fly in Europe, and it won't fly in Parliament.
So Brussels won't accept Chequers. You disagree with Boris Johnson there, then?
Well, no, I think, see, what Brussels may well do is add a few more things on. Well, a lot of people don't like Chequers even more, think it's the absolute last step you can go. You've made all the concessions we can. So Brussels will want to put something else on. They want to put customs union on. They want to put, some other requirements, money or immigration or whatever. And she hasn't got any room for that, I'm afraid. So I think Chequers will die one way or another, either in Brussels or in Westminster, and then we'll need another alternative. And that's why I wrote that alternative last year, over a year ago.
Well, let's talk about the alternatives that are on offer, because there's a bit of an inconvenient truth, isn't there, with the alternatives on offer, and that is the Irish border situation. It's very serious what happens with that border.
Well,
what's your solution?
I don't accept the phrase an inconvenient truth. I think it's an inconvenient exaggeration. And the reason is, I'm reasonably familiar with the Irish border over the course of 20 years or so. There's already a border there. There's a customs border, there's a judicial border, there's a currency border. Those borders all operate invisibly. The only way you can tell is the colour of the stripe in the middle of the road changes colour as you go over the border. But the customs operation, by talking to each other, the Irish and Northern Ireland customs managed to catch lots of smugglers. There was a massive cigarette haul only a few weeks ago. It can be done.
But you talk about things such as, currency border, for example. There's a difference, isn't there, between taking some euros over the border in your pocket and back again, and taking some sheep over the border, for example. It's a different kind of border that we're talking about here, isn't it? And it's not helpful, really, is it, to try and oversimplify?
Well, the people are oversimplifying it, the Irish government and the Commission, by saying, you've got to have a sweeping political answer. There is no acceptable sweeping political answer. What they have to do is look at the detail of tax on the border. Because it's tax, the biggest thing. You're right. It doesn't matter whether you carry a euro or a pound. You can buy your drinks in Belfast in euros, and you can buy in Dublin in pounds. The simple truth is, it's tax, which we deal with already. It's regulations, which is the hardest one, and it's what they call rules of origin. That is, goods coming from the rest of the world going into Europe by a, quote, back door through Belfast. We can control that. There are only 5 ports in the North of Ireland, 5 big ports. We can control that bit of it. The issue is regulation. And you're right, it's cattle going backwards and forwards across the border, it's milk going backwards and forwards across the border, it's that sort of thing.
And it's important, isn't it? You're a military man, you know how important, how sensitive this is.
Yeah, of course.
We're still trying to find bodies
I raised Ireland
of young people who died not long ago.
I know some, knew some of them, but I raised this in negotiation before the Commission did. For exactly that reason. I think there's a moral responsibility there.
So it's not an exaggeration, is it? It's a hugely important...
No, what I'm saying is the problem is being exaggerated, not the importance. I must distinguish between that. And the regulatory stuff, well, there are already special arrangements for Northern Ireland which apply. It's a single epidemiological zone. So, when you take cattle into Northern Ireland, you do have to inspect them, so you can protect that. There are special regulatory arrangements. The other thing that's unified between the North and South is what's called a single electricity market. So you have special arrangements for Northern Ireland electricity generators. So, without putting that border in the Irish Sea, you can do significant detailed changes, and they're not even looking at that.
So would you accept...
We were talking to the Irish government before Mr Varadkar came into power, and they were talking about these things, and all of a sudden it's all stopped. Now it's being used for political reasons. It's a very important issue, but what's being exaggerated is the difficulty of resolving it. We can do it, and look, I tell you, the best test, rather than disappear into the details, your viewers should just ask themselves, who do they believe on this? David Trimble on Northern Ireland, the Nobel Prize winner who put his life on the line to create the Irish peace process, or Barnier or Juncker? Trimble supports the arguments I've put about resolving the Irish border issue.
So would you accept a longer transition to get this right, the border issue, for example?
We don't need one. I mean, you literally don't need one. We've got 21 months coming anyway. That's way beyond what we need to do this. Most of these issues are manageable, not the delays. The issue is not time. The issue is willingness to take on the problem.
Now, another big question, of course, as we go into the conference, is leadership. Theresa May's had a rocky few months. There's been open discussions about her future among Conservative MPs. Would you support her leading the Conservatives into the next election?
Well, that's up to her, frankly. I mean, from the beginning...
Well, it might not just be up to her. There might be a no-confidence vote.
Too, I know.
So how would you vote in a no-confidence vote?
To keep her in. I mean, look, when I resigned, I took a great deal of trouble to depersonalise this, because it seems to me we're conflating leadership on the one hand and policy on the other. I want a change of policy, not a change of leader. And where I differ from Boris, who's front page of the papers this morning, is he's conflating the two. I think this is such an important issue. We must keep it away from internal Tory party battles and from leadership issues. Such an important issue. I mean, look, lots of things he says I agree with, but on this we differ.
Let's talk about Boris Johnson, shall we? I mean, do you think he would make a good leader?
No, that'll probably be after I'm gone. Look,
well, you work closely with him. What's your view?
Well, look,
what do you think?
If you take what he said this morning in the papers, he wants to cancel HS2 and spend it on a bridge to Northern Ireland. Well, I would want to do that. I think one of the blights of British politics is politicians having fantastic ideas that cost a fortune and don't do much good, and that will be one of them. If you're going to use the money, use it for broadband or something else. On housing, he's right. The issue is there, but his answer's wrong. We need to completely rewrite the housing policy and so on. So, Boris is a great mate of mine. We have a very knockabout friendship, but quite a lot of his ideas, I think, are good headlines, not necessarily good policies.
So not perhaps the right person to be number 10?
I don't think it's an issue for today. I mean, the real problem is if we conflate this issue with the mode of Brexit issue, we can get mode of Brexit wrong because it gets conflated with other things. Brexit matters more than any leadership issue or leadership interest of any person. That's the thing the public should bear in mind. Brexit matters more than a person.
I wonder if that applies to Jeremy Corbyn as well. Would you be prepared to vote down the Prime Minister's Chequers plan? We know that you want to vote against it. If it could mean, which it could mean, a general election and Jeremy Corbyn in number 10.
Well, I don't think it
is that something you'd be comfortable with?
I sort of dismiss the premise, really. I will vote against Chequers, full stop. And it won't lead to a general election. I'm not going to debate the fine tactics, because as you can imagine, that's quite important how we do that. But this is, we're capable of managing this through. And the bigger, what used to be the threat was not Corbyn. What used to be the threat was a sort of World Trade Organization or no deal leave. That was the threat. I know that inside out. I've been studying that for 2.5 years. There are 300 plans to deal with it. I know it's not as frightening as all the Project Fear things say. So I'll take that risk, but we won't have to take the risk of Corbyn.
So no general election, you don't think?
No general election. But there will be a very, very exciting autumn in Westminster.
Well, why do you think that then?
Well, because the government's going to, if it sticks with Chequers, it will lose some votes.
And then that could be a problem for the Prime Minister.
Well, losing votes is always a problem for a government, but governments have lost in the past. I mean, I led the first defeat of Tony Blair on 90 days. He didn't suddenly resign the next day, and that was a fundamental central policy of this government.